I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may.
Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone and you're watching The Daily Question. Today's question of the day: were Luke, Han and Leia too old for the new Star Wars trilogy? What do I mean by that? Well, I think the way that these three characters were portrayed in this new trilogy doesn't really accurately reflect or doesn't represent a very good use of the actual characters and how they had aged in the story. I don't mean the actors, I mean the characters that they were playing. So for example, let's look at how they are actually portrayed, the three of them. First of all, you've got Han Solo, and Han Solo has gone back to being a criminal. He is smuggling. But this doesn't really make a lot of sense because he's now a lot older, and you've got this old man who is smuggling like he's a young man still. But the thing is, he doesn't look like an old, gruff around the edges man. He actually looks like an older businessman who's carefully manicured, and it just doesn't really fit the whole character that they're trying to make this older Harrison Ford now play in this new trilogy. Not only that, but like I've said in a previous video, taking him back to a life of crime and a life of smuggling, I think completely undermines his original character arc that he experienced in the original Star Wars trilogy. So in the original Star Wars trilogy, he goes from being a rogue criminal, a rogue smuggler, to being someone who is now willing to give of his very life for the good of others. He ends up in the complete opposite direction, and he's now willing to settle down with this woman. And they completely undermine that whole character arc, that whole redemption arc, by taking him right back to being a criminal. Not only that, but before, when he was a criminal under this evil totalitarian regime. And you sort of you can make sense of that a little bit, but now he's gone back to being a criminal under this new regime, which is not totalitarian, and it's like, well, maybe the guy wasn't such a sort of anti-hero after all. Maybe he was just a bad guy. Maybe he was just a criminal all along who enjoyed nothing more than robbing people and ripping other people off. And so that's why he went back to it. His transformation back into that former life, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. I get why they did it. They were looking to try and have their cake and eat it too. Let's resurrect old Han Solo for one last outing, because we can play to the old school fans here by doing that. But unfortunately, story-wise, I don't think it was a good choice. Secondly, Leia. Leia is commanding the rebel armies. But why? There's a couple of reasons why this sort of, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. She's a lot older now. It's almost like, well, do they not have younger and more vital and more experienced leaders of the rebel armies? Like, it just seems sort of strange that she is in that role. And particularly, you look at both of those films, but in particularly The Last Jedi, she does look a little bit like she's lethargic in that role, and it's like she's not being listened to by Poe Dameron, for example. It's kind of strange. It's a weird sort of role she's got where she's supposed to be in charge, but in many ways she's kind of not really that essential to what's going on. Not only that, but her son is Kylo Ren. Does no one know that her son is Kylo Ren? I'm assuming that people know that Kylo Ren is her son. So you've got this person who is in charge of the armies in a very senior military position, who is actually in charge of fighting her own flesh and blood, her own offspring. Has no one stopped to ask the question, is she actually compromised in this role? Will she actually make the best military decisions, or will she choose her son over the good and the well-being of the wider society, the rest of the galaxy, in a sort of a key moment of engagement? Is she compromised? Is she actually working for the other side? Like, there's some pretty big questions here that no one really sort of seems to have thought through about the relationship between her and one of the senior figures who's fighting against the Rebel Alliance. And then there's the character of Luke Skywalker. And Luke Skywalker is the one character that I think they actually used pretty well when you consider his age in the story. Now, there were some terrible decisions they made around the story writing of Luke, particularly in The Last Jedi. But leaving those aside, the way they chose to portray his character in this particular story, in this particular part of his character timeline, it makes a lot more sense. So, how would I have done things differently? Well, I'm glad you asked, because here's the 3 characters, but this time, here's how I would have written their stories or utilised them in this new trilogy. First of all, Leia. I would have made her a senator. I would have made Leia a politician. So she's no longer involved in commanding armies. She is now in a position which I think is much more fitting to her age and her character's age and sort of where the story's actually at. She's moving in the circle of politics. She is obsessed with this idea that finding Luke is absolutely essential to saving the galaxy. And she is also obsessed with trying to bring her son back from the dark side. Now, being in politics, she has more scope to explore those kind of issues in a way that gives you lots of interesting sort of storytelling potential, I think. So, for example, the way she currently is in the new trilogy, it's kind of a little bit weird when you think about it. It's like, does she not care about her son or bringing him back, or how much does she really care about finding Luke? Because it seems that she's much more committed to leading armies than she is to actually finding Luke, than she is to actually saving her son. It's kind of a little bit weird. So you take her out of that sort of commanding armies position and you put her into a sort of senatorial role, and I think she can do both things really well, which creates some interesting storytelling potential. So, for example, her obsession about finding Luke Skywalker could come up against, say, another politician or group of politicians who think, no, it's not about Luke Skywalker, it's about military power, and we've got to have the greatest technology. And you've got these interesting potentials for conflicts in a story that can create all sorts of different storytelling directions that I think are just a lot more interesting than the sort of very bland way that she has been presented now in the new trilogy. With Han Solo, I think Han Solo should have been retired, and I think he should have been retired into some sort of engineering type role or farming type role. Him and Chewie are together. He's with Leia. He hasn't run off. He hasn't gone back into a life of crime. I definitely would want to respect his original redemption arc. I would not want to destroy or undermine that in any way. There would still be elements of that roguish Han Solo there, but now you're looking at a man who is perhaps a bit older and a bit wiser, which again makes more sense with the age of the character. But he also has sort of come to believe that it's a young man's fight, and that perhaps he shouldn't be as involved, and now his commitment is to his wife. His commitment is to also trying to track down Luke, because Luke was his friend. And obviously he cares about Leia deeply. And Leia is desperately trying to find Luke as well. So you have this potential for him to be conducting those kind of missions. So if you still want to see Han Solo the pilot, you still want to see the Millennium Falcon, you can still see all that stuff. But it's now at the service of, I think, a storytelling arc or a storytelling plot point that makes a lot more sense. And then lastly, there's the character of Luke Skywalker. Now, Luke really needed to be the new Obi-Wan in the story, I think, and he almost was. It was all sitting there and set up perfectly for Rian Johnson by J.J. Abrams, but unfortunately Rian Johnson made some terrible writing decisions about the character of Luke Skywalker that really undermined all of that. What I would have done is I would have had Luke as a recluse, probably even on that same island, that would have been fine, but I wouldn't have had him as the cynical, angry and poorly written sort of character. I would have had Luke, who was an older, wiser Jedi, but who was also fearful of the power that he wielded and the risk of himself being exposed. And so he's keeping himself secret because he wants to keep the galaxy safe. And that, to me, is just so typical of the actual character of Luke Skywalker that's been established. He cares enough about other people to do things that perhaps others wouldn't do. He will take great risks, or he will avoid, I guess on the flip side of that, he will avoid taking risks in order to try and save people. This is Luke. He's a hero, right? He is altruistic. And that should have been his motivation. And then when you have Rey arriving on the island seeking training, Luke is not interested in training her, not because he's just the cynical, angry old man who looks like sort of a man baby in Jedi robes, but he's actually fearful that if he trains her, some very bad things will happen. And so he doesn't want the situation to get worse, but she convinces him eventually to actually help with the training. And then what happens is, as the training starts to unfold, world, you can explore these interesting questions where maybe it gets a little bit doubtful. Is Rey ready for this? Will she actually go to the dark side? And you sort of find yourself going, oh man, maybe Luke was right. Maybe he should have never trained her. And you have all of this interesting storytelling potential that unfortunately has been lost. But like I said, of all those characters, I think Luke was used the most appropriately, I guess if I could put it that way, for the actual age of his character in the new story. It's really common now for people to use the excuse about The Last Jedi of saying that it subverted our expectations and people weren't ready for that sort of subversion of expectations. But if you genuinely care about subverting expectations and you actually want to do something interesting and new with Star Wars, then imagine if those three main characters, Han, Luke and Leia, had been used in a way that was more suitable to their ages, and they had been put into the story not as just older versions of their former self, which is effectively what they've done in this new trilogy. Instead, what they should have done was put them into this new trilogy as wiser, older heroes. These are people who are now in the twilight, not just of the story, but of their own, obviously their lives and their heroism as well. And in that twilight of their heroism, they have to become a new type of hero. They are no longer there to fight the physical battles. Instead, they are there to try and pass on the wisdom, to actually be the wise sages who can say, hey, we're the guardians of this history and we know a lot of important wisdom and you need to learn from us, but they're pushing up against a society or a group of people who perhaps aren't ready for that because of their youth or because of other ideologies or interests that affect the galaxy. And I think that would have been far more interesting. And if you wanted to talk about sort of subverting expectations, then imagine that. Those characters used in a way that in actual fact is more appropriate to their age, but also creates a different type of hero out of those three characters. They're not just the sort of gung-ho space pirates and space wizards and everything else we're used to seeing them as before. Instead, now there's something a bit deeper and more interesting going on. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. There's a link in the description below and a link on screen at the end of this video. That's right, I can hear my theme music too. I'll see you next week on The Daily Question.